Do you know who you are? You're the first lady of ISIS. You and your husband, what you've done to history, and as a result, what's happened to all these people's lives. And I was like, I know, I'm like dying, like I feel guilty.
I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
When we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
Foundations of society are fragile. We must be the shepherds of our own civilization.
If anyone answers either yes or no without making necessary distinctions, both are not telling the truth. They're lying.
Father, we pray that your word will become a hammer that breaks rocks into pieces. That you will raise up in this nation pulpits and prophets that will call the nation back to repentance.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently, or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah initiative, conversation without compromise.
So let's kick off with, you have gained the title the First Lady of ISIS. Now, it took me 30 seconds of reading to realize that's a huge overstatement and completely factually incorrect. It's not to say your involvement is insignificant, but give me the kind of brief rundown of like what you were.
It's very insulting in a sense. Like, who doesn't want to be the first lady of anything? But of that gangster, terrorist coup nation of people that I for so long was arguing against and fighting. I did not want a Salafi caliphate. If I wanted a caliphate, it was not with the Salafis. But yeah, I mean, I wasn't married to Baghdadi. But so that label was given to me by a SMU professor, a history professor. So SMU being Southern Methodist Church. And then I remember talking to, soon after I had that meeting with her, and she labeled me, and she was like, I can't believe you're on SMU's campus. Do you know who you are? You're the first lady of ISIS. You and your husband, what you've done to history, and as a result, what's happened to all these people's lives. And I was like, I know, I'm like dying, like I feel guilty. I feel guilty for being stupid enough to be duped by all of that. But yeah, that was her understanding of me, because she was just shocked that I was there at this elite college, and just for a visit, just talking to some professors. And then the Atlantic, when I told them that story, they used it as clickbait.
Yeah.
Because it's catchy.
Yeah.
But I was for a while before my divorce came through, I was still married to a member of ISIS, an elite person who ran the propaganda magazines, edited, wrote for Dubik and Rumia, propagated the idea of a caliphate and categorized what classical scholars said were the criterion of a caliph. He was the one who documented all of this. The Arabs were not organized enough. They didn't I don't know. Even the what we call, our school of thought is Zahiri in English, and they were the second Umayyad caliphates, viziers, and government scholars. So they weren't like idiots who didn't know anything and made things up. They followed the Quran, authentic hadith that they thought authorized. They had no category for okay. It was either authentic or unauthentic. There was no in between. And which limited how many laws there were in Sharia. So we were also the most libertarian thinking. So it was Quran, Sunnah, and Ijma, which is consensus of the three generations of Muhammad, the first generation of Muhammad, second and third, and what they all agreed on, which is a tiny amount of
Right. So just to kind of catch everyone up listening who doesn't know what the word caliphate is, right? So it literally means successor or deputy. So the idea is Muhammad is the supreme leader of religion, state, and military in his time, and you have someone who's kind of the successor of that role. And it was in the Arab nations for a long time until they're conquered by the Ottomans, who declare a caliphate in the 1200s. And then
I don't know if they said they were a caliphate necessarily. They did. The Ottomans first they weren't Quraysh, and secondly they were an Islamic empire, or I don't think they actually used the title caliphate by that time. And there were time periods in history when there were like multiple caliphates in different parts of this Muslim world.
Yeah. Well, the Ottomans did actually.
Oh.
They didn't take it as seriously as the Arabs did, although not that the Arabs took it super seriously at the end anyway. But Sultan was the main one they used, but
Sultanate. Yeah.
Yeah, but they had an honorary caliph as the role, right?
Yeah, it was a figurehead.
But in 1924, that's when the caliphate was dissolved by the Ottomans. There are actually riots in India because of that, because they didn't want the caliphate to be dissolved. So really there's been a hole for this kind of thing in the Islamic world since, for a long time. But for the last kind of 100 years, basically, there hasn't been anyone claiming that role. So John, your ex-husband, was, from what I understand, was one of the leading scholars in the world who was studying the subject and advocating for the subject.
Mm-hmm. He was, I don't want this to sound far-fetched, but he really did revive it, the idea, when so many people had just thought it's never going to happen again. And he had the website that so many pro-caliphate Muslims who were really looking for an Islamic head of power, they would go to his website, his blog, which had all the criteria with all the classical scripture and the sayings of scholars that we didn't even like as a school, but they were Salafi scholars or Hanbali scholars, and he would give the opinions of all schools of thought, the four main living modern, well, not modern, but the remaining four scholars, what their opinions were, their views based on their Islamic knowledge of the importance of a caliphate, and that you can't even. The importance was so crucial that Muhammad couldn't be buried until a leader, a deputy, had been designated to take his place. So we even thought it was more important than prayer. Basically, that's how John and I and what we had learned from previous caliphates, the administration, that was the importance.
So, and then from what I hear, right, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is kind of the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. That's a great episode title, From Al-Qaeda to Al-Maida.
Oh no, I don't like. This is worse.
This was.
It's worse to be from Al Qaeda than ISIS. I'm not from either.
So you're never actually technically part of either of those groups, right? But so
I will. Like when I was young, and so when I had this change in my life, I had a mental breakdown when I was a teenager. I got no therapy for it. Felt worthless. I don't like. This is like I think a lot of teenage youth go through the same identity crisis and mental instability that I was going through. Maybe mine was on a larger scale. Mm-hmm. I just like to think other people can relate. But yeah, so I turned to religion, and the only religion really accessible to me was Islam. And I had moved to an area where I was surrounded by fanatics who shamed me and slut-shamed me for being Western, too Western for their liking, too British. And they couldn't handle my girliness and my femininity, and they wanted to like cover me, and I bought into that.
So and we'll dig a little deeper into the upbringing and what led you there. But just kind of getting the sort of the full picture of who John was and who you were in relation to him. So another thing I read online, which I'm sure is true because everything on the internet is true, is that
only state good.
You're a good source.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq, and basically John calls all the mullahs of Iraq and says, okay, this guy is from the Qurayshi tribe, he's got the right lineage, he's got all the qualifications. If he doesn't declare himself caliph, then he's in sin. Yeah. And so Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's hand is forced by that.
Guilt-tripped
into being like, oh gosh, I guess we got to do a caliphate. Right, so his kind of maybe he wants that as well, but he's at least partially pushed into it. Is that... So while you were never part of ISIS, your story connects very closely to the story of the kind of redeclaration of a caliphate. And so that's at one point something you personally were working for, right? Not as part of ISIS, but...
As a Muslim mother, I was rearing children to establish a caliphate, for sure. To be generals and fight anyone who got in our way for that.
So now I've established that, right? You were never technically part of ISIS. You were never part of an actual terrorist organization. You were never, like in ceremonies, wearing a hat as the first man of ISIS gives a speech or anything, right? Your role is you're married to a key player who became a part of what ISIS would become after you guys separated. And so your role in that is not like as a member of the organization, but as the kind of...
My role was his doormat wife.
Yeah.
To put it truthfully, that's what it was.
So then, let's talk about how that all happened, right? So talk about you're from England. So talk about you growing up in England.
Okay. So I was born in Edgware, but moved to Harrow as a toddler, and we thought that was moving up in the world. But my mother grew up in Whitechapel, Aldgate area, which was previously a Jewish ghetto. When the Jews did well, moved out, the Bengali community moved in and turned it into Bangladesh. With some, it stinks. It smells of dried fish. It's very pungent. And so she was there in the 60s. Her dad first went to the UK in 1945, so right after World War II. So I feel like I'm not really sure if I'm third generation or second generation British, whatever, it's a bit of a blur. And then my dad came in his 20s, which was the early 70s. And then I was born in the 80s, I'm born in 83, and raised in Harrow. I, as a young child, was a snob from a young age. I was the fourth unwanted daughter, I have to clarify, because with Bengali culture and a lot of Muslim countries in general, boys were prioritized, girls were. It's like I see what my mom would have said. If abortion had been allowed in Islam, she would have probably just done what millions of women in China and India did, and that was abort their daughters, so that it was all about having a son, to carry on the name, to look after the elders. So I was the fourth daughter, and then my family became. I was happy. I was a bit of a attention seeker, being the fourth child, but I was also neglected and somewhat spoiled and and unruly because my parents were too tired to care at that point. And I think, and I try to be very fair about this, had I come from a culture like a Lebanese culture or Jordanian culture or something that I felt was more of a loving, beautiful, ancient, a culture of more substance than what I understood of Bangladeshi culture and the poverty and the harshness. I know that a lot of my elders were traumatized from war, of separation of India and Pakistan. Pakistan, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, and then prior to that, it was separation of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. And so, like, generations of trauma and famine and all these things, and you've got this culture that comes to England who has children to serve them, and feeling very unloved led me to turn to I wanted a community. And I've met an Algerian friend of mine, and I thought she was a Palestinian, and I was like, because she was so fair and she had a hijab and she was really beautiful, and I was like, oh, I've seen this on the news, Israel, oh, everyone blames the Muslim world, you know, and I was like, are you a Palestinian? And she was like, no, I hate when people say that. I'm Algerian and we speak French. And I thought she was so cultured. And with my security and depression as a teenager, I looked to her and I was like, wow, I'm in love with you. Like, not sexually, but I'm in love with you and I want to mirror your image. So she loved me. You know, we just bonded. We had fun. She was like probably the bestest friend I've ever had in my life. And having fun as a Muslim is rare. It's a rare occasion. But she made it fun. She could still be a fun personality and be an extremist Salafi jihadist. And
putting the fun back into fundamentalism.
That's awesome. But you know, she taught me a lot about Islam, and then I wanted to be like her because she was just, to me, angelic and the purest heavenly person walking this earth. So I idolized her in some sense, but I didn't know it. My family could see it though. They could see that I was, and my mum wasn't nice to her because she thought my mother blamed her, and I have daddy issues and mummy issues and all those things, and society issues and my own issues. But yeah, it was when I radicalized. So I wanted to embrace God. I was raised as a Muslim, not liking the image of Allah, because for me again, I was a fun-going girl and I wanted fun, and he sucked the fun out of life. And my parents were controlling me with religion, especially my mother. But then I wasn't allowed to question religion either. So my moral standards were not liberalism. Everyone can just do whatever what the government says is that you can trust them, and that's how you. I didn't think of those terms. I thought the gold standard is what God says, because I hate people. But I also have issues with God, but I'm scared of God. I'm really scared of God. So I thought whatever God said is how it is. And I was very afraid. I wasn't given the skill set to think for myself. Like, I wasn't given better ideas or values. I had older sisters. They never radicalized, but they were also very eager to please my parents and very eager to fit in. But I'd faced so much rejection from society that not only was I angry, and I found that Allah had anger issues too, and I could relate, and then it made it worse. But you know, there were also aspects of Islam, like the priority of family values and cleanliness and staying away from alcohol and being modest, and because that's what I thought were good. I thought everybody has to live that way, otherwise they're bad. You know, I thought very black and white.
Well, and honestly, to everything you're saying, right? There's a level of good there, right? Family values, you know, honesty, those sorts of things.
I wanted a patriarchy even, which is really like not PC to say.
Yeah.
But I desired it because I didn't have that father figure role, which is what I see is partially very alluring with Christianity, is that he is your father, your loving father, is merciful. And that concept is void in Islam. It's not there.
Right.
Because you're not allowed to believe he's your father. You're not allowed to believe he has children. And honestly, when you compare his loving qualities to his wrath, it's not balanced. There's an imbalance.
So yeah, and whereas in the Bible, and I don't know about how Jewish rabbis would think about this, being a father is integral to God's very nature. So I believe it's in Deuteronomy, the first time it defines God as father. And the way it defines fatherhood is it says, I found him, talking about Israel, in the desert place. I encircled him. I covered him in the shelter of my wings. I provided the best wine and the best fat of the land, and I kept him as the apple of my eye. And the idea is that God is the kind of fatherhood is supposed to be protection, instruction, unique attention, and generosity, right? Those are the qualities of God as Father.
And wisdom.
And wisdom, right?
Yeah.
In the Bible. And, you know, discipline. And I really believe that if you don't have a good father, it's actually really, really difficult to understand God as Father, right? So I think Islam, if you're without a father, Allah is not Father. You're not required to understand him in those terms. And
we're told Abraham is the father, and imitate him.
Right.
Which isn't the same, but.
So if you have this,
you can't really ever feel that way if you don't,
Yeah.
It's easier to believe that God is your father.
So it's like if you have an inaccessible, unpredictable man on earth who you can't really have a conversation with, well, to say that there's kind of an unpredictable, unapproachable deity that you can't really have a conversation with properly, it fits, right? It's easy to go there.
I don't know if I was just the most illiterate teenager when I was young. I liked English and I did A-levels, but concepts like merciful and grace were not in my everyday vocabulary as a Muslim. When we said Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, I think that those words have more meaning to Arabs than it did to non-Arabs, and especially in, again, my culture, because I think it's very, objective to say that there are better cultures over others, and then you can even see the demographics of terrorism and the levels of terrorism. Like, people can say, we know Muslims in Muslim countries that are not nearly as extreme as Muslims in the West. And that just goes back to an identity crisis. And there's also a pattern in history, because when, during the Crusades, when a lot of Muslims moved to Europe, especially Spain, the second generation, like Levant, people from the Levant who lost power as the first Umayyads, the generation afterwards, they felt angry. They felt robbed from what they felt was an entitled power in that region. And so then another caliphate sprung up there in southern Spain.
So you're in the kind of perfect or the imperfect storm for you to kind of be reached by kind of radicals, right? So tell me about the journey of going from, okay, I think I should become more Muslim, to, okay, actively supporting terrorism, right? What is that journey like for you?
So I wasn't the brightest bulb in the light box, and I always blame my again, if I had been allowed to be a free thinker and allowed to think, like, if I had the freedom, if I'd been raised with the freedom to think for myself, I wouldn't have been such a follower. So I had this new group of friends, and I wanted to be accepted, and they were from Al-Muhajirun, Hizb ut-Tahrir, Salafi, Al-Qaeda. This was my gang. This was my girl club that had my back, and I let them think for me. So when they told me, oh, look, come home to my house and meet my parents, and they'll explain to you how Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden saved the Muslim world from the Soviet Union, and we're the Mujahideen are heroes and Muslim warriors, and I was like, totally fell in love with that image, and with rose-colored glasses. Because for the first time in my short life back then, I was like, wow, I actually have a history. I have there's dignity in it. There's like beautiful stories and things. So I was absorbing that all, and then from my foundational beliefs, thinking that anything that opposed God is haram and forbidden and almost practically satanic, it was really hard for me back then to oppose that idea and to have my own ideas.
Well, to be fair, if anyone told me today the Soviet Union is haram, I'm like, fair enough.
Yeah. They killed more people in history than Islamists.
Right. So
they ate their babies.
Yeah. So honestly, a country rising up against the Soviet Union and fighting them is a great story, right? That's one that's very easy to feel like, you're on the right side of it.
Yeah, and it took religious zeal to have men fight such a strong army like the Soviet Russians. It's like they're crazy soldiers. They're badasses. It's a tough force to go against, and you probably need just something as comforting as being told it's a one-way ticket to paradise for you and your family to risk everything to fight such a huge enemy.
I actually know one of them who lives here in Seattle. Not like the extreme, because you have different factions, right?
Former Soviet Union. like a mujahid.
Mujahideen, yeah. Not one of the kind of like, not one of the more, because it's factions, right? Not one of the more extreme ones.
There were good ones too, like reasonable ones.
And so he seems like a very, reasonable guy. But my experience with him is my friend Anwar, right? I lent him some video games because it was COVID and he works at the ER, needed a break. And so I kind of bought him some video games, and then he says, I won't get too close, I don't want to get you sick. And his dad comes out of the house and says, Anwar, your friend is here, invite him in, we'll get food.
Well, why not when you put all your trust in God?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, it made me do some crazy brave things, and it could be called stupid things, but like, when you believe in God, and it gives you strength and power that you would not ordinarily have. But again, if it's the wrong God, it will make you can be a very good, normal human being and one day, and then do some crazy bad things, crimes the next.
Yeah.
And when you believe it's for God, you start, as Muslims, it really is, it's supposed to be a self-sacrifice where you give up your willpower for God's will. And it's hard.
So, going from that kind of radical crowd, right, how did you go from radical ideas to actually joining kind of radical circles in your adult life?
So, once I left the UK, I went and visited Syria, and it gave me, a different perspective of Arab culture.
And you're going to Syria with John, right?
With John in 2003, and
who you met?
It's still radical. I met John online on a marriage website. And this was really taboo at the time. This was only 2003.
Oh, wow.
And so we were both 19 years old, and he was like constantly harassing me, sending me messages, and I would send like, no, I'm looking for someone older and richer. You're 19, what are you doing in Syria? But it was also really intriguing. And I would say I was rebellious because I used radicalism as a form of rebellion around my Muslim community and my family, especially my family, because it gave me the chance, instead of them hating me with their misogynistic values and saying I'm not good enough, I was finally saying, you're not good enough.
Yeah.
So I used it subconsciously. I didn't even know what I was doing, and nobody could figure it out. And so I met John, and he was an American, he was Greek. He had a handsome picture of him with a trimmed beard, and I was like, oh, good babies. We'll have nice, good-looking babies, and that's the aim of the game. Intelligent, good-looking kids. And that was my way of contributing to the world. But, yeah, so I got married. We traveled a bit. I came to America, and I was just, I was amazed with the people, the quality of the people here. The fact that, so when I got married, John made me wear everything, and I wasn't doing that before I was married. I was just wearing pretty hijabs and natural makeup, whatever I could get away with. But still, I was getting shamed by the Muslim community. Even atheist Muslims in the closet would be like, look at her, she's still trying to look pretty.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was just their misogynistic culture that they came from. They weren't trying to be understanding, maybe pretty girls like being pretty because it's fun. They just wanted to hate me. And but he made me wear everything, and I hated it. And he would tell me why. He would say, well, khimar means a head cover that goes over your bosom, and the Prophet's wives wore this, and not only the Prophet's wives, Zayd bin whatever, and all these scholars would say that you have to only show one eye, or and then I would see, traveling, I would see different types of hijabs and niqabs, and I favored the less one, but under pressure and because obedience in Islam, and I was a Sunni, not a Shia, so they're completely different. I had to be subservient to John, just like I had to be subservient to Muhammad, even though I didn't actually like Muhammad's character. But I had to suppress those ideas because I was like, I'm a human. I'm a slave to God. And if I oppose God, that's from Satan, and Satan scares me just as much as God. and just it does eradicate a sense of individual responsibility, because and causes paranoia that you think that there's spirits constantly trying to control you every time you have a conscious idea, like a alarm in your mind, a red alert, like danger.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a good thing. Jump off the train now. But you have to suppress it. And I think every single mujahid, every single ISIS member, every single radical has had to deal with this.
That's an interesting use of that word, because the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans uses the term, everyone suppresses the truth of God in unrighteousness, right? So it's this thing that you're observing in people where it's like you always have these moments where you have this isn't right, but then you'll have to push it down, right? And whether that's you're joining a religious cult, or you're stealing money from your job, right? Whatever you're doing,
unless you're a narcissist, I think those type of personalities and psychopaths.
Yeah, I think they exist, but I think even then, there's like at least a logical conversation about it, right? And that you still have a inner dialogue is like, no, and you kind of like, I even think people like that kind of have a path that you kind of go one way or the other, because like for me, I tend to be pretty clinical about things and not especially empathetic, right? So I could easily see myself going down a path where I'm completely unconcerned about people. But I'm pushed beyond that, right? By the word of God, by things in my life but I know that I could push those, you sure you should be doing this, moments down.
Yeah, you could violate people if you wanted to, but you choose not to. But atheists do the same.
Yeah.
They have and agnostics, and you can stop. But when you allow a 6th, 7th century ideology control you, and you can't, if you're not rebellious enough to fight it, it's going to take over you, and then that's why you're going to long for death, because you're living a miserable existence.
Because you've kind of allowed yourself to be given things. There's a series called Man in the High Castle. Have you ever seen it?
Yes, I've seen it.
Okay, so spoilers for Man in the High Castle, season 4, episode 10. There's that amazing moment in the last episode where you've seen the finale, right?
I can't remember it so well, and I don't know if I liked it. Is it a spin off World War II?
Yeah.
Actually, that was really good. Or is that? I don't know the show.
So one of the main characters, right, at the end, he's like basically got to the point where he does not have the Nazis breathing down his throat anymore, but then he's still putting together plans for another Holocaust in America, and they're on a train. He's on a train with his wife that's about to crash, and his wife says to him, "John, this is evil," and he says, "I know, and I don't know how to stop." Right, so I think
I've been there.
Yeah.
Because even John used to say to me, because I hated wearing the hijab in Texas, while he was in prison, so he went to prison in 2003. We left Syria because I was pregnant at 21. I was 20, and then I didn't want to have a child born in Syria. I was being opportunistic, and I was like, well, I really do like it. Like, I wanted to live in America. But John thought it was the Dajjal, the evil, the Freemason land of Satan. He was obviously mentally imbalanced, but he had such a deep hatred for the government. And his dad had served 30 years in the U.S. Air Force. So he had a very stern upbringing. And didn't see his dad. It's really complicated with him. But he didn't love America, and he was a traitor. But the problem he had with me is that when I came to America and I learned American values, I was like, I'm missing out.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had grown tired of all the rules. I was sick of how I'd lost any choice in my life, because now my husband was literally telling me what I can and can't do or think. He was trying anyway, but it was an internal war. In our home, it was war, but outside we would act as if we're on the same side. And I think a lot of couples who are not so happy have to put up this front. And we stayed in the marriage together for 10 years because we had children, and I had nowhere to go. I didn't have family I could reach out to for help because they didn't want me. They didn't want me from the beginning, from the time I was born. And they made it so clear too. So like it's not healthy for any child to grow up knowing they're an accident, unwanted, and it's as bad as a child being born into drug addicts and or being abused. It's a different psychological abuse because of the culture.
There's nowhere to go. It reminds me, another pop culture reference here. You watch Lost?
Yes.
Okay, so spoiler alert, Lost season 6.
I love your commentary on Netflix.
There's a point in Lost season 6 where there's kind of there's this sort of shady faction, and Ben Linus like does something wrong and then says and he starts walking towards the other faction, and they said, Ben, where are you going? He says, I'm going to join the others. And they're saying, why? It's because no one else will have me.
Yes, exactly.
And it's like such a fascinating journey because honestly it parallels the book of Genesis in some ways, because Eve is in this situation where the temptation of Satan is, if you will just do this, then your eyes will be opened and you'll have kind of freedom and knowledge. Yeah, like knowledge of all things, right?
Oh, was it knowledge?
It's knowledge.
It wasn't about living forever.
You already had that.
Oh, yeah.
So it was about knowledge.
Oh, yeah, right. I remember.
And so it's almost like it's a kind of parallel promise, right? That it's like your whole life has been a quest for freedom, and Islam, ironically, although it may be hard, it seems for you to be just kind of this quest for freedom, right? It's something that promised you freedom, but in fact enslaved you. And the same with...
Well, it promised me freedom in the afterlife.
For sure.
Because freedom wasn't something I even was raised to believe. It wasn't a value. It's devalued. And it wasn't until I came to America that I really valued it and did want it in this life, because I got tired of being run down and not having choice in my life. So yeah, I was disillusioned with the rules. But yeah, exactly what you were saying about Islam. They'll accept everyone and anyone. You just say one declaration and you're in the religion and you can never leave, otherwise you're going to die. And you're going to be in hell forever. So if you really believe in hell and you believe that God is sadistic enough to send people to hell for small things, no matter how good they were, that alone was very disturbing to me. Like, I empathized with the story of Abu Talib, and he never became a Muslim. He was Muhammad's uncle, and he gave up everything he had, all his wealth, all his family ties, everything he had that made him one of the most respected and dignified people in his society. He sacrificed it all for Muhammad. Yet he still, when he died, he wouldn't accept Islam. And then the hadith says, or the revelation says, that he'll receive the lightest punishment in hell, which is having iron put at the bottom of his soul, and he'll burn like that for eternity.
Right. So
when I was young, I didn't question it, and that really scared the life out of me, because I thought, this life is hell for me, and I don't want to go to a place that's worse for eternity. But then when I was older, I was like, I'm more merciful than that. I would never do that to anybody, not even to my greatest enemy. So it wasn't until I was like 25, and I really think that point in my life, as growing into a mature person and as a mother, my priorities shifted a great deal, and again, that dislike that I had for God when I was a little girl, because he sucked the life out, the fun out of Western life for me, and I couldn't integrate. I was feeling that again, because I wanted to integrate with American society, because I love their values. I love the US Constitution. I remember when I first came across the Declaration of Independence, and I bawled my eyes out, because I scolded John, because I was like, you grew up with this. And I was oblivious to these ideas: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And it was all I wanted, like, so much, not just for myself, but for my children. Yeah.
So to the interesting journey, right? This fear of hell takes you to what essentially is the edge of hell, right? That you've seen humans make a hell on earth, right? So you kind of went to these, you went after these ideas, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and becoming more and more enslaving.
And the more I learned, the more I disbelieved, because the more I was like, these are people who have ridiculous ideas, and these men, the scholars in Islam, the misogyny, I could see. I was like, they hate women so much, and I hate that they get to talk about, make fatwas or rulings about women's conditions and health and how they should behave around their in-laws, or how they should behave with entertaining guests constantly when they're suffering, and be forced to have children, and there's no concept in 6th century Arab thinking about depression or postpartum depression and the hardships of raising a child. And it's like, in Islam, that's what you're just made for, and you're not really allowed to have any other potential than being, because the hadith says that marriage is half your religion. So if you're not married, you're inadequate. You are only attaining half of your religion. What's funny is that there's so many Islamic scholars were not married. They were young men. You've got to wonder why. Maybe they were gay. Maybe this was their way out, saying, I knew gay Muslims who were gay before they embraced Islam, and it was a lot of, they just had to suppress, but they had families and lived happily. But it's kind of sad still. Yeah.
So
they had to give up who they are. Like, I had to give up who I was for Allah,
without ever really having the chance to discover who you were.
Yeah.
So this is your journey in. We'll wrap it up for this episode, but we'll be back next week with the next part of Tania's story, another episode of the Al-Maida Initiative podcast.